in terms of the things that professionals may need to do in order to comply with the various pathways that CALGreen has put forward. And we'll try to cover as much as we can within the time frame, but of course, there's so many rabbit holes there and little deeper conversations about each of those pathways. Happy to do that after the webinar and one-on-one as well. So a brief agenda and some housekeeping items for today. We'll go through what is, first of all, embodied carbon, because I know a lot of people on the call, and especially in the state of California, would already be aware of embodied carbon and its impacts, but we'll briefly touch on why it is an important perspective. Then we'll look at the overall policy landscape within embodied carbon and what that has led to this CALGreen embodied carbon requirements. And then we'll look at the various compliance pathways within CALGreen. And then I've written Q&As separately in the agenda, but actually, since we've joined a Zoom call, I really, really encourage folks that if you have any questions at any point, just put them on the chat, and we will try to take them as we go, because some of them may be relevant to the slide that is being shown at that very point. My colleague from One Click, Aileen Carroll, she's on the chat, and she will be able to reply to any questions that she can reply to at her end and share links and stuff like that. But if there's something that I need to answer at that point, she will indicate to me, and then I can answer those as we go. And if there are questions that we find suitable or best answered after the discussion, we will do that. We will do that as well. But yeah, no questions or bad questions. Just fill that chat up with questions. We would love to hear more. And okay, so now the first item on the agenda. So what is embodied carbon? Why are we even having this discussion in the first place? Embodied carbon, as technically defined, is all the greenhouse gas emissions, which are, of course, measured in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents that arise from the manufacturing, transport, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. Now, what does that technical definition really mean? Is that historically speaking, a lot of focus that we've put in terms of the whole carbon debate and climate change is a lot of those carbon emissions come from operational carbon, which is the energy we need to sort of power our buildings and make them habitable and useful to human beings. And through the lifetime of that building, energy, water, and other inputs that go into maintaining that building. However, embodied carbon, which is a more recent rhetoric and a concept, sort of aims at looking at what are the impacts of the materials that went into making that building in the first place. What about those impacts? The impacts that would have taken to sort of extract minerals from the ground, transport all those minerals and raw materials to factories, make all those products, and then transport those products to sites, and then installing and assembling those materials at those sites as well. So now research has shown that that is actually a very significant portion of overall emissions of buildings over their lifetime. And as such, it's something that we can't ignore anymore. And it actually forms a considerable portion of our overall emissions. And that's what this graph shows. So if you look at overall global emissions, 40% of, approximately 40% of those come from the building sector or the built environment. And that 40% can further be divided into 2/3 of it that still comes from operational carbon, as we were calling it, which is the energy you need and on an ongoing basis to make a building useful. And the remaining 1/3, or close to 33%, come from the embodied carbon, which is all the various materials and the processes that you needed to actually make that project happen in the first place. Now, why has that become an urgent consideration? Is because we are building more and more every day, and there are parts around the world which are going to keep building more and more structures, and it's just going to accelerate. It's not going to stop. So we need to sort of make this an urgent consideration, because once you make a material choice as architects, developers, construction professionals, you make those choices today, and tomorrow, not literally speaking, but tomorrow the building is up. So the embodied carbon happens very, very fast. And as soon as you make a material choice, you've sort of decided that you are going to choose that material on the project, and that material then comes with a certain amount of emissions and certain amount of environmental impacts. And that consideration of embodied carbon is going to become even more important as time passes. And that is a prediction that research has shown, that although today embodied carbon is 1/3 of overall built environment emissions, but as we decarbonize our energy grids and try to find more renewable sources of energy, try to have those deployed at scale, there will be a time when actually the embodied carbon portion will be way more than that 33% and might actually be a significantly large proportion of the overall emissions within the built environment, and which is something, of course, that makes it a very urgent consideration, and which is why you see things like CALGreen pop up and lots of other regulations around the world pop up as well. Now, to speak a little bit about embodied carbon policy. So we've understood so far that embodied carbon is an urgent consideration. It's something that needs to be taken into account by developers, architects, and construction professionals. And by virtue of that, there's, like I said, many policies that have come around the world, and some of them mandatory, some of them more based on interest. And different regions have responded sort of differently. Some of them are more stringent out in areas, say like Europe and UK, where things have happened more historically. North America as a market is now fast catching up as well. So within these embodied carbon policies landscape, there are three things to always remember. So it is not always about codes and regulation. Yes, CALGreen is introducing mandatory requirements. There have been Buy Clean California, Buy Clean New York acts, which have aimed at construction professionals choosing only specific kinds of materials that are quote unquote more sustainable, lesser carbon emissions and stuff like that. But at the same time, these codes and regulations are a small part of the overall system, which includes a whole lot of other things. One is lots of technology and innovation that needs to happen along with it, which is creation of new materials or new kinds of materials which are more sustainable, making our supply chains more efficient and better to ensure that the amount of emissions that happen due to them are reduced, making our industrial processes more cleaner and more better in terms of embodied carbon. So it's not just about the codes and regulation, that it needs to go, of course, hand in hand with whole lots of technology and innovation that needs to happen. Along with the technology and innovation, a lot of reporting as well of by, say, construction material manufacturers saying, oh, my material is more sustainable or less sustainable because it comes with X amounts of carbon, Y amounts of water pollution, et cetera, et cetera. And those things can take need some sort of cost and time and effort as well. And at the same time, apart from technology and innovation, you need incentives. You need that there need to be some sort of grant programs, which there are. So EPA has lots of grants, and I think I have a slide on that in a little bit as well. Then there are some sort of like zoning incentives within the state of California that I know that reward developers based on the energy efficiency and the sustainability of their projects. So I just wanted to give that little bit of context that no regulation sort of works in silos. It's designed in a way that it works well with the rest of the system that that is going on out there as well. Now, within that landscape, and as I already touched upon, there are various ways that the governments are trying to tackle this problem. And within the US itself, and as I'm not going to go into all these little things on the slide here because that will take way too long. But just the intent of this slide is that at the federal, state, and local levels, there are many building policies that are coming up. And then there are specific public policies, building codes, and local codes that sort of aim at ensuring embodied carbon is looked at and reduced in the long run. So my intent here is that CALGreen is not just alone and working in silos with other policies as well. There are many other policies out there as well. And you can actually follow this this wonderful resource. Carbon Leadership Forum's website has a map that actually can show you what are the various city level, national level, state level policies in various parts of the country, and you can see lots of interesting things that are happening out there. And of course, the biggest focus is on CALGreen, because that's the first mandatory requirement from construction professionals. And there are some examples here. You have Buy Clean California, and I'm quite sure that many people who are on the call may have heard of it before or would have definitely interacted with that requirement as well, which aims at buying clean. So by definition, it means buying materials which are less harmful than other materials. So buying only materials that have, one, disclosed their global warming potentials, carbon emissions, and are also within a certain threshold number. But then going beyond California, there's a New Jersey Buy Clean. I know there's a Buy Clean New York. There's Portland Low Carbon Concrete Initiative, Austin Green Building Program. So many things out there that sort of are looking at embodied carbon. And then, of course, you can see CALGreen on the slide as well as something that has introduced embodied carbon. Speaking of federal efforts, and as we were discussing, there's many grants out there through the Inflation Reduction Act. EPA has grant programs specifically for manufacturers who want to publish EPDs, and we will touch upon what EPDs are in a later half of the presentation. But essentially, you can't do embodied carbon calculations without something called EPD, or an environmental product declaration. And creating an EPD requires a little bit of effort and time and cost, and which is why these grant programs sort of aim to make it super easy for manufacturers to do so. Because if that happens alongside the policies that aim to get construction professionals to be doing these calculations, only then will the whole industry move forward towards a path of lower carbon and more stringent regulations probably in the future. But there is money out there that can enable manufacturers to do that. So all the AEC professionals on the call, if you work with manufacturers and you've been having sustainability conversations, there are many resources out there to sort of get them to look at these grant applications and programs and maybe take advantage of them as well. And now coming to the elephant in the room, CALGreen. So so far we've just basically touched upon what is embodied carbon, why is it important, why it is important as a consideration, and then going on to discuss how these policies sort of come about and the role that they play. But CALGreen specifically was the first of its kind green building standards code of California. It's nothing new, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know way more about it, historically speaking, than me. Introduced in 2007, been in effect since 2009, and has certain overarching goals. Of course, one of the bigger overarching goals is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, which is one of the main goals, specifically in terms of looking at climate change and global warming considerations, and the role that built environments, especially from a state like California, plays in that. The second is to promote environmentally responsible, cost-effective, and healthier places to live and work. Also looking at energy and water consumption of buildings and making sure that they are controlled and within certain limits, and responding to any environmental directives of the government, the administration. So it has several of these overarching goals, and to achieve all these 4 goals, CALGreen basically has 5 different environmental focus areas. Some of the focus areas are like planning and design, the way buildings are planned and designed, keeping environmental considerations in mind. Energy efficiency, so energy or operational carbon, as we were calling it earlier, is given a specific consideration within the code and has been there for a much longer time. Water, of course, efficiency and conservation, and the environmental quality of buildings. And then there's a specific focus area called material conservation and resource efficiency. And this is where embodied carbon part of the policy is housed. And for some time, it was a voluntary sort of a measure as to doing life cycle analysis and showing the embodied carbon impacts of projects. But that is what is changing next week, which is it's becoming a mandatory requirement to sort of report on embodied carbon of the project. So it's within the material conservation and resource efficiency focus area. And this is what happened. I've been saying it, but this is what basically the picture says. First statewide embodied carbon building code requirement in the US, mandatory for certain kinds of projects. Now let's take a look at what kind of projects are covered by the code as we speak and what kinds are not. But keeping in mind that it's, of course, something that can change at any time in the future, and more kinds of projects may be introduced, and the threshold areas that they've defined right now could also be reduced. Right now, any school projects, public schools, community colleges, which are above 50,000 square feet, or non-residential building types, which are above 100,000 square feet, are covered by the mandatory embodied carbon requirements. And some of the non-residential building types include, but not limited to, industrial buildings, commercial offices, retails, labs, universities. So all of these beyond this area threshold, all of these kind of projects will be included with these requirements. What is not included is, of course, the opposite: public schools and community colleges, which is less than 50,000 square feet, and non-residential building types, which are less than 100,000 square feet. And then the residential building types, which have to comply with the residential requirements of the CALGreen code, which we are not going to get into in the scope of this webinar, but they have to comply with those. And of course, they include single-family residential projects, multi-family residential projects, and hospitality projects. Now, a few clarifications. Now, you guys would know that Buy Clean California Act applies on certain public projects and where they need to meet the global warming potential limits of certain materials that they use. Now, the Buy Clean California Act requirements supersede the CALGreen requirements there. So those specific kind of projects will still have to do the Buy Clean California Act requirement as well. And then the Buy Clean California Act did not have concrete as one of the materials listed within its requirement, but the mandatory CALGreen limits do have concrete listed as well as one of the materials. So anything that falls under the Buy Clean California Act, any kind of project, they will still have to do. Since concrete was not there to do CALGreen, to comply with CALGreen, they would still have to include concrete as one of the materials as well. And we'll discuss more on that, on what that means in a few slides. Now, in mixed-use buildings, where both residential and non-residential portions exist, or mixed-use upcoming projects, both the portions will have to comply separately with the residential requirements of CALGreen, and the non-residential portions will have to comply with the non-residential portion. Of course, embodied carbon would only be applicable if the non-residential portion is above 100,000 square feet, going by the requirement in the first place. Now, this is where rubber meets the road. So in order for any of these qualifying projects that fall under this mandatory embodied carbon requirement, in order for them to comply, they have three choices. So there are three pathways, so to speak, which are in some way mutually independent, in some ways not, and I'll explain what that means. But you can choose between one of these three pathways and decide what is it that you want to do in order to comply. The first pathway itself is called building reuse, which is essentially more than a pathway or things to do. It's more of a reporting requirement. If you are building a project, which is essentially an adaptive reuse kind of project, you are already doing something which is sustainable, which is it's always better than building new materials and having to manufacture all those and make like a new building as opposed to reusing the building stock that we already have. So if you meet a certain requirements that are set within the building reuse requirement, you can comply with this mandatory embodied carbon CALGreen requirement. The second pathway is doing a life cycle analysis. Now, of course, a very small proportion of the qualifying projects will actually be building reuse projects. And a lot of the remaining, or a majority of the projects, actually will have to choose between life cycle analysis or the third pathway, which is prescriptive pathway. Now, life cycle analysis pathway is simply doing a life cycle analysis and of the building, and then coming up to a certain carbon and other environmental impacts of the building, and then doing another second version of that life cycle assessment to show sort of like a reduction in those values. And I'm covering this quickly because I'm actually going into a little bit more depth and detail into these three pathways in the coming slides. Then there is a prescriptive pathway, which is documenting materials and revealing the global warming potential and environmental impacts of the materials that you have chosen for your specific project. Now, before I move on, it's important to understand that within these three pathways, there are some mandatory requirements. So which is the minimum possible that you need to do as a qualifying project in order to comply. But then they also have two tiers above that. Above the mandatory requirement, there's tier 1, and then there's tier 2. And the reasons for those are that, yes, you can do the minimum, bare minimum, and comply with the regulation. But if you do tier 1 and tier 2, you've gone above and beyond what was required from you. And then there is a little caveat on the left, which is local jurisdictions in the times to come can actually have a choice in terms of requiring qualifying projects to do tier 1 and tier 2 instead of the base mandatory requirements as well. So that there is a provision for that. And they can also, the local jurisdictions can also reduce the square footage threshold for the qualifying projects as well. So that's not something that's happened yet, but it is something that is possible. And cities on their own and could decide that, hey, the carbon impacts of a project, let's just, for example, say in the city of Los Angeles is very, very high. So we're going to increase the requirement to tier 1 and reduce the square footage threshold. So more projects could qualify. So that could happen as well. Now, speaking of the building reuse pathway, and the mandatory requirement here, if you're choosing this specific pathway for complying, is that 45% of your structure and enclosure has to be reused in order for you to comply with the requirement. And then if you want to go to the next level, you want to be that amazing sustainability champion, you could go for 75% of the structure and enclosure to be reused. And then there's, and if you include 30% of interior non-structural elements also reused, you can reach tier 2 as well. So those are the basic requirements. But just to dive a little deeper, there are certain thresholds here as well. So for reuse pathway, the alterations to building, if that's the use case, the combined altered floor area has to be 100,000 square feet or greater for a building to qualify for, or a project to qualify for the reuse pathway. In case of additions to an existing project, the total floor area combined with the existing floor area of the building as it existed before the additions, both of them combined, if that is above 100,000 square feet or greater, then the building or the project does qualify for the reuse pathway. However, there's an exception. So, and the exception basically aims at that if you're doing an adaptive reuse project, now you take a small building and then you build a mammoth project around it, which is way larger than what this actual original building was. So after a certain threshold, that would not count as an adaptive reuse. So it's to prevent those kind of situations where if the combined additions to existing buildings exceed 2 times the area of the existing building itself, then you can't qualify using this pathway. You would then have to go to the life cycle assessment or the other prescriptive pathway route, because you've essentially built a lot more of a new structure as compared to what already existed out there. And as already mentioned, you have to ensure that you maintain at least 45% combined of the existing building's primary structural elements and some parts of the enclosure as well. So that's the reuse pathways, minimum requirements, and how certain projects through certain thresholds qualify for this specific pathway. And like I said before, it's not like doing an LCA. So it doesn't have, it does not require you to do a process and a project per se, because you've already done something good here. You have reused existing structures. So if you qualify, then you can just fill out the documentation and you're good to go. I'm going to take a quick pause and check on how am I doing on time, Kaylin?
You're doing well. You have 20 minutes, about maybe 18 minutes left.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so for the full screen, I was unable to look at the time, but thank you for letting me know. So that's the reuse pathway. Now let's go forward to the life cycle analysis pathway, which is the second pathway, in which we actually predict as one of the more commonly used pathways, because like I said, not many projects are going to qualify for building reuse. Now, within life cycle assessment pathway, first of all, it's important to understand what in the first place is life cycle assessment. And I won't go into too much of a depth and detail of this methodology. It's you can find a lot more depth probably if you read up on online sources, and of course, happy to meet one-on-one after and schedule calls with people as well. But essentially, life cycle assessment is a way of looking at a project or a product and looking, and as the name suggests, life cycle, looking at what led to this project or a product being born, so to speak. That is all the raw materials that were extracted and used to make, until the very end of the life cycle of that, which is literally the last stage where it's the end of a building's life cycle. It's deconstructed, demolished, and stuff like that. So when these LCAs are conducted, yeah, another thing I could say is it's not something nascent to the construction sector. You could do an LCA for literally anything. You're the laptop that you're watching this webinar on, the pens you use, the shoes that you wear, any product or process in the world can have an LCA associated with it. And the terminologies remain the same. It's like a language that has been created by environmental professionals to be able to speak to each other in common terms as into life cycle of various products. And essentially what you see on the screen is the three different main stages into which these life cycles are divided, which is A stage is all your product stage, your manufacturing of raw materials, and finally assembling them and making a structure stand in the first place, which is your A1 to A5, as we call it. And a lot of LCAs that are done out there are done for that stage, because that's where a lot of embodied carbon impacts come in. But then you also have B stages, which is use stage. While using a structure or a building, there's some material that may go out, come in, there's refurbishments, replacements all the time. So there's that stage. And then there is C stage, which is end of life, which is when your building has reached its final days, so to speak, and it has to be deconstructed, demolished, and waste has to be processed. Now, whether you choose to recycle then, or whether you choose to landfill some of that waste, it can cause major differences in terms of carbon emissions. So that's essentially, in very, very broad terms, what life cycle assessment is. And like I said, there's a lot more detail that can be unwrapped there. But moving on to the life cycle assessment pathway, because we're talking of CALGreen, the regulation, there are certain requirements there, which is, one, you have to conduct what we call a baseline LCA, which is an LCA which is done for your at a pre-design stage or at your first level of a design, and then you sort of report on what that LCA leads you to see, certain carbon emissions and other environmental impacts that you may find out of that LCA. And in order to comply with this pathway, you have to then show another LCA, which is done at a different stage and shows a 10% reduction on the first LCA. So, and 10% reduction in terms of carbon emissions. And why would those reductions happen? Because, in your second LCA or your second design, you may have chosen to use lesser material. You may have designed that second design more smartly, just in terms of the overall materials used within the limited space that you have. Or you may have used materials which have better performing EPDs, which are already cleaner materials, um, um, and and you would be using the materials which have lower carbon emissions in terms of their A1 to A5 stages, in the way they were made, in the way they were transported, and just the amount of kind of energy that was used in the first place. And then these LCAs, like I said, it's a universal methodology which is followed throughout the world. They have to comply with certain ISO standards in order to be eligible for CALGreen reporting, which is ISO 14040, and the baseline design has also been defined within the regulation that it has to be of the similar size, function, complexity, location, type of construction, and material specification. And now these baselines, of course, when you use LCA softwares, there are features there that can help you do these baselines, and you could also do them on your existing designs as within your companies as well. And the softwares that you use as well need to conform with certain ISO and EN standards as well. And then there are a few other considerations that they have mentioned that need to be included within this, which is the primary and secondary structural elements included in the assessment are footings and foundations, beams, walls, roofs, and floors. And then some enclosure components are also included. And the reference study period, because for doing any life cycle assessment, you have to sort of consider a lifetime of that specific product or a project, which in this case is assumed as 60 years. And then for compliance verification, there's specific worksheets and summaries of GWP analysis that need to be submitted with the authorities. And there's also a component of inspections. Now, the summary of those GWP analysis and worksheets, like I said, we have limited time on this webinar, but we can discuss a lot more in any follow-up sort of conversations. And now we go to the third compliance pathway, which is called a prescriptive pathway. So we've already looked at. I see that we have a few questions. Already for the building LCA, so maybe let's cover those. So for the building LCA, is it optional, mandatory to report stage A5? It is mandatory to report A5 in the way it's been defined under CALGreen, but that's a very good question, because if you're doing LCAs for different requirements, let's say we're talking of CALGreen now, but then there could be, for different certifications, you can always find that language to what stages need to be included and not included for those specific requirements. So that's actually a great question, because whenever you're doing an LCA and the softwares actually help you do that, you can just put into these softwares that you are doing this LCA for CALGreen, and it will make sure that all the stages that are included are as per requirement. And does that 100,000 apply to just the building, or is it the entire project site? I believe the 100,000 applies to just the building, although that's a great question and something that we can definitely verify. But I'm quite sure it applies to the to the building. But it's TBD, and we will verify that information as well. So now, quickly moving on, because we're I see we are 10:47 and have a limited time left. Looking at prescriptive pathway, so which is we've now looked at building reuse. So you could reuse an existing project. You've done a great thing. You comply with CALGreen, or you do a life cycle analysis, show a reduction in your overall environmental impacts, and you're compliant. But if you don't want to do those things, CALGreen has said that there is a prescriptive pathway wherein what you need to do is you need to make sure your material choices are sided towards materials which, number one, have reported on their overall environmental impacts and publish them in form of EPDs. And secondly, are within certain threshold, especially in terms of global warming potential. And those numbers have been published by CALGreen saying, okay, you have to choose these specific kind of materials which have revealed their impacts, and they are within certain numbers of GWP. And that's and if you do that and you document that information and submit it, you can comply with the regulation with this pathway. Now, the only caveat here is that sorry, is that in order to do that, you need to, of course, find materials which have EPDs and some of this information out there in the first place. Yeah, sorry about that. And then you of course have to make sure that the global warming potential of your chosen EPDs or your chosen materials are within a certain number. Now, for example, the mandatory requirement is that it's within it's within 175% of the EPD GWP limits as defined by CALGreen. But then you can go to tier 1 and tier 2 where it could be within a certain 150% of the GWP limit, and then there is tier 2, which is at those GWP limits. So you can essentially saying that tier 2 would be you choose materials which are so sustainable, they're well within the GWP limits defined by the regulation. But in order to do that, just to touch upon for people who are not aware of on what are these EPDs in the first place, and what you see on the screen right now is an example of the first page of an EPD explaining various environmental impacts of a specific kind of material, and not just ranging to global warming potential, but includes many other environmental impacts as well. And EPDs are global. There's many EPDs by construction material manufacturers from around the world, and these are usually published by something called as program operators, which are certified agencies around the world that have the power to get these EPDs third-party verified and publish them. And only if they are verified and published is when you can call it an EPD. So it's a completely multi-party verified kind of a document. So it's the closest to the truth, so to speak, that you can get in terms of the environmental impacts of a product. Again, in markets like Europe, EPDs have been present for a long time, and they've been commonplace, and people have been getting them published at a very fast rate. And we're seeing a similar trend in North America now, where lots of concrete mix manufacturers, steel, and lots of other materials, insulation, and all these companies are now coming forward and saying we need to have these EPDs out there. And to understand these a little bit better, think of them as food labels. So just like when you buy a food product from the grocery store, it has all these different information metrics on it, saying number of calories, sugar, and lots of different things that go into the product. Think of it as a label for construction materials, thereby increasing the transparency that a lot of the construction manufacturers have in terms of saying this is our material and this is the impact. And EPDs are essentially made by conducting LCAs for these products. So just like we discussed life cycle analysis for construction projects, for creating these EPDs, you have to do life cycle analysis for these individual product types. And then the result of those LCAs is what leads to creation of these EPDs. And only if you have these EPDs in the database can you then do project level LCAs, and you can do the prescriptive pathway as well. They're third-party verified, like I mentioned. They're standards compliant based on ISO and EN standards. EPDs can be plant-specific, which is, say, I'm a concrete manufacturer and I'm doing an EPD for my concrete mix from a certain plant, let's say in Washington State, just as an example. They can be manufacturer-specific. That is just I'm a manufacturer, but it's not specific to a plant. Or it could be industry average EPDs, which are made through research, and it's like saying a certain kind of material in a certain geography has certain environmental impact. And EPDs, of course, avoid greenwashing. And like I said, they're third-party verified, so they're fully compliant. And EPA actually has plans to, from what we understand, standardize the creation of some of these EPDs in the long run. I see some questions about EPDs. If a product-specific EPD is not available, what other types of EPD secondary data is allowed to use for LCA modeling? Like I just mentioned, you can use industry average EPDs if your specific plant type EPDs are not available. In fact, that's how the hierarchy goes. So most accurate could be plant-specific EPD, so you know exactly the product that you're taking. Then the next proxy would be that specific manufacturer, or another manufacturer in the same geography. And then you have industry average databases as well. And then I know I have 7 minutes left, so I'm gonna try to finish this as soon as I can. So in terms of prescriptive pathway, which is the third pathway that we were at for CALGreen, the regulation says that as long as you document your materials and their EPDs, for specific materials, and these are the materials that you see on the screen right now. There's ready-mix concrete, there's types of steel, flat glass, and insulation. So they have published this list on the website, and this is a screenshot of that. So you have various material types, and then you have maximum acceptable GWP value of those materials. So, you know, if we use these materials, we have to make sure that we have EPDs for those materials, and they specify that the GWP values of those materials are within these specific numbers. Now, where do these numbers come from? The intent here is to encourage, like I said, professional to use products for which EPDs are available and have lower GWPs. And these numbers are based on 175% of Buy Clean California Act GWP values. So by the looks of it, you know, 175% still seems pretty high, but the intent here is to get industry professionals, AEC professionals to start documenting these like this and start looking at materials from a different point of view, to start looking at materials not just from their function, but also their environmental impacts, and making it almost like a second-hand habit to always look for EPDs and speak about EPDs with manufacturers. So as long as they're within this 175% range of the GWP values that were published by Buy Clean California, you're compliant. And those are the numbers that were there on the previous screen. And since concrete is not a part of the Buy Clean California materials, they follow the similar logic, but against the NRMCA 2022 benchmark values for concrete products. So just to very quickly recap, I know we had a limited amount of time, so we've just brushed upon a lot of things about CALGreen. Embodied carbon regulation, mandatory, going into effect next week. 3 different pathways. If you reuse a building, and as long as it follows certain criteria, you can follow the building reuse pathway for compliance. If you are planning to do a life cycle analysis, as long as you choose softwares and are able to make sure that the life cycle are as per certain ISO standards, and then you show a baseline LCA versus a reduction, that's another way to comply. The third way is to do a prescriptive pathway, which is you choosing materials which have published EPDs and which have global warming potentials lower than specified values, and you are compliant. So 3 different pathways. And how can you be successful in doing that? Starting early, as early as possible with your design stage. You do not have to wait till the end of your final design to do an LCA or any of these different calculations. You can literally start from day one. And there are tools out there that help you do that. And in fact, doing a baseline as early as possible would be great. Remind yourself that there are different worksheets, qualifying softwares, reports, and inspections kind of perspectives that you need to be aware of in terms of the regulation. And like I said, I'm very happy to get on one-on-one calls with anyone who's interested to go over some of that material as well. And ask questions, which is why we're doing this webinar in the first place. Ask questions from USGBC, from One Click LCA. I know there are many other resources out there. There's AIA California with lots of wonderful webinars and resources. Carbon Leadership Forum website has lots of resources as well. And like I've been saying, I know we are at almost a couple of minutes away, so I'm happy to take maybe 1 or 2 more questions. But if anyone wants to discuss more, maybe book a meeting with me to have a one-on-one conversation. My email ID is on the slide here. My LinkedIn is there, and the QR code will actually help you book a meeting with me at the time of your choosing. Now, I will quickly take a look if we can maybe answer one last questions. Yes, so I saw, I'm not able to find out now, but I did see questions about EPDs, whether if they're not manufacturers from a specific region, if you can use EPDs by other manufacturers as well. Yes, you can, as long as the EPDs that are conducted are, of course, verified and published and are as per ISO standards and within certain GWP limits. I don't think that would be a problem. Yes, and then I saw a couple of questions about baselining. So it's been a big point of debate. How do you conduct a baseline in the first place? I know there is some language in the code that tries to guide you that it has to be in the same region, specificity, and things like that. We are yet to see language on how that will be verified and some process around that. So that's to be announced, so to speak. But essentially making sure that if there are glaring mistakes and when the LCAs are verified, that if you chose a material which was way more GWP and then finally you were able to drop it to much lower, of course those are very visible. So you can do this. However, the softwares that we've been speaking of that allow you to do LCAs are designed to be able to help you conduct these baselines based on your favorite and usual materials that you choose. But baselining is definitely something that's a slight question mark, but would love to have discussions with folks as follow-ups, like I mentioned, on that topic as well. Yes, so I see that we are already at 11 o'clock. So I know I may not have been able to cover some questions, but I can't say it enough. Please, please, please feel free to reach out, and we would love to chat and answer some of those questions as well. And I hope this was helpful. I know I've been babbling on for some time now, so I hope some of you were able to take some value out of the things I had to say. And thank you so much again to USGBC for helping us conduct this webinar. So over to you guys, Gillian.
Okay, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. All right, I'm just going to share, if I can, just the final. Just. Second here. Okay, everything is in the chat. The attendee contact form, the survey link. Just in case, I'll share this final slide. Again, thank you to our generous sponsors, One Click LCA. Thank you to our presenter. And I'm just going to share this slide here so that we can see our training evaluation survey. We would love for you all to fill out this survey. The link is in the chat as well, and here's a QR code. And we hope you enjoyed this informative workshop today. All right. Thank you, everyone. If you'd like to support USGBC California, you can text GREEN to 707070 to donate now. You can stay connected with us via USGBC California CA, USGBC CA, on our LinkedIn and Instagram. All right, everyone. Thank you again. We very much so appreciate your attendance and participation. Don't forget to fill out the attendee contact form. And the link to the presentation will be available next week. Right. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.